The smell hid the vanguard of the Ottoman army 3 miles before they even saw the city, a stench so thick and unnatural that battle-hardened horses refused to move forward. Sultan Mehmed II, the man who had conquered the unconquerable city of Constantinople, rode to the front of his freezing column, expecting to see a defensive wall or a line of archers waiting for him. But what he saw as the sun burned through the morning mist made the conqueror of the world vomit into his hands and order his entire army to turn back without firing a single arrow. Before him stood a forest not of trees, but of 20,000 rotting bodies elevated on stakes, a silent, screaming monument that proved Vlad Dracula had dragged warfare into a realm of madness. What happened to the Ottoman prisoners under Vlad III was not simply execution or the brutality of medieval combat. It was a carefully orchestrated theater of psychological destruction designed to break the mind of an empire. You are about to step into the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains, where a prince with a small army decided that if he could not outfight the Ottomans, he would out-terrorize them. This is the true story of how one man turned the human body into a message so terrifying that it stopped the most powerful military machine on Earth dead in its tracks. Forget the vampire legends and the Hollywood capes, because the reality of the Impaler is a story of political desperation, where the currency was human suffering. The Ottoman soldiers marching toward Wallachia believed they were on a standard punitive expedition to remove a rebellious vassal who refused to pay his taxes. They expected skirmishes, ambushes, and perhaps a siege, but they did not expect to walk into a landscape where the rules of war had been completely rewritten by a sociopathic genius. Vlad knew that he could not defeat Mehmed's army of 60,000 men in the open field, so he decided to attack their minds long before he attacked their bodies. He turned the geography of Wallachia into a weapon, burning his own villages and poisoning his own wells so that the invaders walked into a starving, dying land. But the starvation was just the prelude to the true horror that awaited the scouts who were sent ahead to find a path for the Sultan. These scouts would vanish into the dense forests and never return, or worse. They would be found days later, arranged in grotesque tableaux along the roadside. Vlad did not just kill them. He arranged them like artwork, leaving them displayed in ways that defied the sacred laws of both Christianity and Islam. The Ottomans began to whisper that they were not fighting a prince, but a demon who feasted on pain, and morale began to disintegrate before the first battle cry was raised. The psychological warfare peaked with the legendary night attack, a suicide mission that revealed the depths of Vlad's fearlessness and cruelty. In June of 1462, Vlad disguised himself as an Ottoman cavalryman and walked right into the Sultan's camp under the cover of darkness, speaking fluent Turkish. He mapped out the location of the Sultan's tent while surrounded by thousands of his enemies, marking the spot where he intended to cut the head off the snake. Hours later, he returned with his knights, launching a chaotic assault in the pitch blackness, engaging in close-quarter slaughter while the Ottomans killed each other in confusion. The intent was to assassinate the Sultan, but even though they missed him by a few tenths, the message was delivered with bloody clarity. Vlad was untouchable, he was everywhere, and he was willing to walk into the jaws of death just to prove that he did not fear the Dragon of the East. The Ottomans woke the next morning to find their camp destroyed and their comrades dead. But it was what happened to the prisoners taken that night that shattered them. They were not held for ransom, they were not traded for peace, and they were not enslaved to work the fields of Wallachia. They were marched to the outskirts of Targovik, the princely capital, where the stakes had already been prepared in a vast concentric circle. Vlad ordered the creation of the Forest of the Impaled, a landscape of death that stretched for nearly 2 miles, creating a corridor of horror that the Sultan had to march through. The prisoners were stripped of their armor and their dignity, arranged by rank so that the officers were placed on higher stakes than the foot soldiers. It was a hierarchy of agony, a twisted mirror of the Ottoman military structure, preserved forever in wood and rotting flesh. The method of execution was specific and calculated to deny the victim a quick death, bypassing vital organs to ensure hours or even days of consciousness. Vlad wanted the invading army to hear the voices of their friends, to look into the eyes of men who were dying slowly and begging for water. He knew that an army cannot fight if it is vomiting with fear, if every soldier is picturing himself on the stake next to his brother. The silence of the dead is frightening, but the moans of 20,000 dying men created a wall of sound that no charismatic speech from a general could overcome. When Sultan Mehmed II arrived at this forest, he saw something that violated his understanding of conquest and dominion. He saw infants impaled next to their mothers, and he saw birds nesting inside the rib cages of his finest janissaries who had been rotting there for months. The Sultan, a man who had ended the Byzantine Empire and seen rivers of blood, reportedly said, "How can I despoil a man who does such things?" He realized that he was fighting a man who had no limits, a man who had weaponized his own soul to protect his borders. But the horror was not just for the Ottomans. It was a message to Vlad's own people and the boyars who constantly plotted against him. Vlad practiced a form of justice that was absolute and terrifying, believing that crime could only be stopped if the consequences were unthinkable. He applied the same brutality to his own subjects, creating a kingdom where a golden cup could be left at a fountain and no one would dare to steal it. The Forest of the Impaled contained Ottoman soldiers, but it also contained Wallachian traders, thieves, and nobles who had crossed the dragon. This equality of punishment terrified the Ottomans even more because it meant Vlad did not value Muslim life less. He simply valued obedience above all human existence. The prisoners captured during the retreat were subjected to humiliations that were designed to offend their religious sensibilities and cultural pride. Vlad understood the Ottoman custom of wearing turbans, and in one infamous encounter, he asked visiting envoys to remove them in his presence. When they refused, citing their custom, he commanded his guards to nail the turbans to their skulls so they would never have to break their tradition again. This story spread through the Ottoman ranks like wildfire, reinforcing the idea that diplomacy with Dracula was a death sentence. It wasn't just physical torture. It was a mockery of their identity, a permanent violation of their customs executed with a carpenter's hammer. The prisoners became props in Vlad's theater, used to decorate his dining halls and line the roads to his castle. Legend says he would dine among the stakes, dipping his bread in the blood of his victims, watching the life fade from their eyes as he enjoyed his meal. While modern historians debate the literal truth of the blood dipping, the metaphor is undeniable. Vlad sustained his power by consuming the fear of his enemies. The dining table amidst the dead was a psychological statement that he was immune to the horrors he created, that he was the master of death itself. For the Ottoman prisoner, the worst fate was not the stake, but the realization that they were merely scenery for a madman's lunch. They watched him eat with calm precision while they suffered the most agonizing death imaginable, a contrast that broke their minds before their bodies failed. The Ottomans tried to erase these events from their history books, describing Vlad as a minor rebel rather than the monster who halted their expansion. But the soldiers who returned to Constantinople brought the stories with them, whispering in the tea houses about the land where the trees grew men. They spoke of the smell that never left their clothes, the stench of a legion rotting in the sun, a scent that woke them up in the middle of the night for years. Vlad III had achieved the impossible. He had traumatized a superpower with a fraction of the resources, using only wood and gravity and fear. The legacy of these actions created a permanent scar on the psyche of the region, blurring the line between national hero and mythical monster. To the Wallachians, he was a savior who did what was necessary to stop a seemingly unstoppable force from enslaving them. To the Ottomans, he was the devil incarnate, a Kaziklu Bey, the impaling lord, who had to be destroyed not for territory, but for the sanity of the world. The capture of Ottoman prisoners became a rare event because soldiers would often fight to the death rather than risk being taken alive by Dracula's men. This desperation made the Ottoman army less effective, as discipline broke down in the face of absolute terror. Commanders reported that their troops were hesitant to scout, hesitant to pursue, and prone to nightmares that sapped their strength. Vlad had successfully haunted the waking hours of 60,000 men, effectively defeating them before they could even unsheath their swords. But the terror required constant escalation. Once the enemy became numb to one horror, Vlad had to invent a new one to keep the fear fresh. He began to experiment with mass displays, arranging bodies in geometric patterns that could be seen from the nearby hills. He turned death into architecture, building walls of bodies that served no defensive purpose other than to say, "Abandon hope, all who enter here." The Ottoman prisoners were forced to build their own stakes to sharpen the wood that would eventually claim their lives. This forced complicity was the final twist of the knife, making the victim a participant in their own destruction. The psychological toll on Vlad's own soldiers was also immense, as they were the ones forced to carry out these orders day after day. They lived in a slaughterhouse of their own making, fearing their leader almost as much as the enemy did, knowing that disobedience meant joining the forest. This created an army of men who were completely desensitized to violence, capable of atrocities that would make a normal man weep. Vlad's legacy is often debated, but the reality of what happened to those prisoners is a historical fact that transcends moral judgment. It was a descent into a primal, violent madness where the human body was reduced to a tool for sending a message. The beyond medieval warfare aspect lies in the industrial scale of the suffering, the systematic application of pain as a state policy. Medieval war was brutal, yes, but it usually had rules of engagement, concepts of ransom, and a basic respect for the value of a noble prisoner. Vlad burned those rules and replaced them with a doctrine of total annihilation of the enemy's spirit. When the Ottomans finally retreated, they left behind the forest of the impaled because they could not bear to touch the bodies. The site remained for months, a silent city of the dead that travelers would detour miles to avoid. Nature eventually reclaimed the stakes, and the bodies turned to dust, but the land itself seemed to remember the weight of the suffering. Local legends say that the birds never return to that valley, that the soil there is darker than anywhere else in Romania. Vlad was eventually defeated, not by the Ottomans, but by his own brother, who was installed as a puppet ruler by the Sultan. But even in defeat, Vlad had won the psychological war. The Ottomans never attempted to fully annex Wallachia again in the same way. They preferred to rule through proxies rather than send their own soldiers back into the land of the Impaler. The memory of the stakes was a more effective border wall than any stone fortification could ever be. The Sultan, Mehmed the Conqueror, went on to expand his empire further, but he never spoke of Targovik without a shadow crossing his face. It was the one place where his power meant nothing, where his armies were rendered useless by the sheer magnitude of one man's cruelty. The prisoners who died there were not just casualties of war. They were sacrifices on the altar of Vlad's legend. Their deaths fueled the myth of the vampire, the undead monster who drains the life from the living, a metaphor for a prince who drained the courage from an empire. Today, we look back at these events with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination, trying to understand the mind behind the stakes. Was he a psychopath, or was he a pragmatist who used the only weapon he had against an overwhelming force? The answer is likely both, a terrifying combination that allowed him to commit unspeakable acts with the clear conscience of a patriot. But for the Ottoman prisoner kneeling in the mud, waiting for the hammer to fall, the politics did not matter. All that mattered was the wood, the pain, and the unblinking eyes of the prince watching from his horse. The transition from human being to marker on a map was slow and agonizing, a journey through pain that has no words. We must remember that these were men, fathers, sons, brothers, who found themselves in a story that had turned into a nightmare. They are the silent witnesses to the fact that there are things worse than death, and Vlad found them all. The sheer logistics of impaling 20,000 people is a staggering thought that reveals the obsession of the perpetrator. It would take weeks of labor, thousands of trees, and a dedicated workforce doing nothing but preparing death. This wasn't a sudden massacre in the heat of battle. It was a cold, calculated project managed like a construction site. The banality of the evil is what makes it so chilling. The orders given, the supplies gathered, the bodies arranged just so. In the end, what happened to the Ottoman prisoners under Vlad III changed the way the world looked at warfare. It showed that a small force could defeat a giant if they were willing to abandon their humanity completely. It proved that fear is a heavier burden than armor, and that a reputation for madness is the strongest shield. The forest of the impaled is gone, but the shadow it cast stretches all the way to the present day. We still tell the stories, we still make the movies, and we still shudder at the name Dracula. Because deep down, we know that this wasn't magic, and it wasn't a fairy tale. It was history. It was real blood, real wood, and real screams that echoed off the Carpathian mountains. And if you listen closely to the wind in those valleys, you might just hear the silence that the Sultan heard. The silence of a world holding its breath in the presence of true, unadulterated horror. A horror that was, indeed, far beyond medieval warfare. It was the birth of modern terror. So the next time you hear the name Vlad the Impaler, don't think of a vampire in a tuxedo. Think of the smell that stopped an army. Think of the forest that wasn't made of trees. And remember the 20,000 souls who were turned into a message that the world has never forgotten.